Welcome to the discussion of policing in the U.S. and Israel, repression and resistance. We have two speakers tonight, two wonderful speakers. And then we'll have questions after the speakers, not during. I'm Steve Golan, a member of North Jersey Jewish Voice for Peace. Jewish Voice for Peace organized this event. We're an organization committed to justice for Palestinians and by extension, to justice for all peoples. Also sponsoring tonight's meeting is the Palestinian American Community Center, also in North Jersey. If you would like to donate afterwards because you like the program and you think it's worthwhile and you want to support work like this, your donations will go to North Jersey JVP, to the Palestinian American Community Center, to the Adalah Justice Project, where one of our speakers is from, and to the People's Organization for Progress, where our other speaker is from. There is no easy way to donate at this time. You will get an email asking you later, afterwards, if you'd like to donate and telling you how you can do it. And now let's start. Our first speaker is Larry Hamm, and I want to introduce Larry now. Larry is a human and civil rights activist and a humanitarian and public speaker, and the founder and chair of the People's Organization for Progress, POP. POP is a statewide, independent, grassroots organization working for racial, social, economic justice, and peace. Larry Hamm was raised in Newark and has been a relentless advocate for African Americans and the cause of human rights and civil rights for all oppressed people for more than 48 years. His impact as a student activist at Princeton is chronicled in the documentary film, Blacks at Princeton. During this time, he was given the honor of addressing the UN Special Committee Against Apartheid. Currently, he has been leading POP's Justice Monday protests against police brutality at the federal building in Newark for the past 100 weeks. Our speakers are each going to speak for 20 to 25 minutes, and then we will have questions and answers. Larry, you're up. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much. And I want to thank Jewish Voices for Peace for inviting me tonight. It's really good to be here. I didn't know I was going to be the first speaker. I thought I was going to be the second speaker, ladies first. But be that as it may, I'm glad to be with you to discuss this issue of the police and policing, both with regards to Israel and the United States. And yes, the People's Organization for Progress, we too support justice for the Palestinian people, self-determination for the Palestinian people. And I'm sure there'll be more discussion on that with our second speaker. And I'd also like to put out at the very beginning that one of the connecting issues here is the relationship between police in the United States and police in Israel. And police brutality is a common problem. The police kill and brutalize African Americans and other people in the United States, and the police in Israel kill and brutalize Palestinians and other people there too. So we want an end to the police brutality. One of the connecting tissues is the fact that with regard to police training, there are and have been established relationships between police departments in cities in the United States with the police in Israel. They have sent people to the U.S. to train police here, and the police here have sent leaders and police from the United States to Israel for training. And, you know, you mentioned my involvement at Princeton University, which was ages ago, which was actually like 45 years ago when I was a student at Princeton. And at that time, we were fighting against the racist apartheid regime in South Africa. We were trying to get Princeton University to divest its holdings in companies that were giving material aid, financial assistance, political assistance to the racist apartheid regime. And one of the things that we discovered at that time was the close relationship that existed between the apartheid regime and the Israeli government. And at many levels, including training for the police, training for the army, also with regard to nuclear technology. This was a big issue at that time. I think it's one of the most non-kept secrets that Israel does have nuclear weapons, did have nuclear technology. And in fact, they made that available to the South African regime. And, we're here now 40 years later, and we see a similar kind of relationship between police forces in the United States and police forces in Israel. Police brutality is a historic problem in the United States. For African Americans, it's a problem as old as the police themselves. I'm sure by now, many of those folks that are active in Jewish Voices for Peace are aware of the origins of the police. This is something that has come out, during the protests around George Floyd, that in fact, modern police forces evolved out of slave patrols that existed in the colonies before this was even the United States of America, when this was still a British colonial experiment and a British colonial endeavor. And, I learned of this years ago. I mean, it's become popularized recently, but I learned of this through a book by Herbert Apteker, Slave Rebellions in Colonial America. And he discussed the origins of the police. And those people that have studied the history of the United States have been aware of this. But the fact remains that the police, modern police forces as we know them, are instruments of the state, just as the slave patrols were instruments of the state, just as the enslavement of African Americans, Africans at that time, Africans in this country, was a state endeavor. That is why we seek reparations for African Americans who are descendants of those who were enslaved in the United States, because this was not just a private endeavor. This was not just engaged in by companies like the East India Company and others, but this was in fact something that was supported by government at all levels, local, state, and national. We're here, I'm here. I'm sure people are watching this program from all around the U.S. and probably from in other parts of the world too, but we're here in New Jersey. Many people equate slavery with the South, but New Jersey started as a Dutch colony about 1620. And by 1624, enslaved African people were here doing the heavy labor, building roads and building dams, constructing edifices, etc., agriculture, etc. So slavery in New Jersey is literally as old as the state itself. And so what do enslaved people do? They rebel. We rebelled in Africa. We rebelled on the slave ships. We fought the colonizers in Africa. We fought the ship captains and their crew on the slave ships. We fought when we got here. In fact, in that book I referenced a minute ago, Slave Rebellions in Colonial America, Herbert Apteker says there were at least 400 recorded slave rebellions and perhaps numerous others. So when you have a situation where people are being brutalized in the most inhumane ways imaginable, and when people have been denied their freedom and denied their humanity, they are going to rebel. So you need instruments of the state power that have the power to kill, that are licensed to kill and to brutalize, to in fact hold down the enslaved people, to in fact put down rebellions when they rebel, and to in fact control their movements throughout the community. And so we had the slave patrols. And after emancipation, it took a civil war to end slavery in the United States. By the way, more Americans died in the Civil War than in World Wars I, II, Vietnam, and Korea combined. Nearly, some people say 750,000, some historians say as many as 1 million. That's what it took to end slavery. And then once slavery was overthrown, people began to move, formerly enslaved people, now the freedmen and freedwomen, began to move from agricultural areas to the cities and began to move from the South to the North and to the West. And with that movement, local municipalities began to develop modern police forces to control their movements. And from the beginning, the issue of police brutality was a serious one. You can go back and read W.E.B. Du Bois, Black Reconstruction. You can read his work on the Philadelphia Negro. You can read St. Clair Drake, Black Metropolis, and Kenneth Clark, Dark Ghetto. From the time of emancipation until the time of today, police brutality was a serious problem. And in the 1960s, there were nearly 1,000 urban uprisings between 1960 and 1972, because what happened after enslavement, we had 100 years of Jim Crow legalized racial segregation that continued our oppression. In fact, some people say our re-enslavement. And then you had the period of the 60s, the Black Power period, and the Civil Rights period, Civil Rights Movement period. By the way, yesterday was the anniversary when Rosa Parks sat down, engaged in civil disobedience to protest the laws of segregated travel on buses there in Montgomery. So people in the 50s and 60s began to rebel against racism, in some places peacefully through civil rights demonstrations, and in other places there were uprisings. Some people called them riots. We call them rebellions. If they were simply riots, they would have been just a handful and easily put down by the police. But between 1960 and 1972, there were more than 1,000 urban uprisings, and almost every one of them was precipitated by an incident of police brutality. In Newark, New Jersey, in 1967, the people rose up against police brutality, triggered by the beating of a Black cab driver, John Smith, and people rose up. The 1,300 member police force couldn't put it down. They called in 700 state troopers. They couldn't do it. And then they called in the National Guard. I lived through that experience. I saw the Guard roll up, not just in regular vehicles, but in half-track, small tanks. We lived in 1967 under military occupation. And one of the things that has come out with regard to the recent protests against police brutality, particularly those around Michael Brown nearly 4 years ago, and George Floyd today, is the militarization of the police. And some people have said that this militarization began, after the Michael Brown uprising. But I would say that, that was just like another wave. The serious militarization of the police begins after the uprisings of the 1960s, when it was clear that local police forces by themselves could not contain and put down the rebellions of Black people against racism and oppression in the inner cities and urban ghettos across this country. And so there was a book that came out. I can't remember the author's name, but the title of the book was, I believe, no left turns. And they talked about the need, because unlike other countries where the police are nationalized, where the police force is a national police force, here in the United States, it's decentralized with thousands of municipalities across the country, each having their own police forces. And this was rather unwieldy and cumbersome for the state. So they began to make moves at that time to try to increase coordination. They couldn't create a national police force, but what they could do was increase coordination between police at the local, county, state levels with the military. And around that time, 1968, I believe it was under, it might have been under Nixon, it might have been under Johnson toward the end of his term, or Nixon at the beginning of his term, they created the LEAA. I believe it was called the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, to in fact provide money, resources, material, training to help increase coordination between local police forces and the military and the state police, so that they could more effectively control the urban populations. Also, we see during this time continuation of the interstate highway projects, where many of these interstate highways, like 280, that runs through Essex County and runs through one side of Newark, New Jersey, and 78, which runs through the other side of Newark, New Jersey. These also had a purpose. They had multi-purpose, but one of their purposes was, in fact, to enable military vehicles to move more quickly into urban areas. This was a counterinsurgency effort. They saw the Black masses as engaging in revolutionary activity, and this effort to coordinate the police and to change the environment in such a way that the police could more effectively control the population. This was a counterinsurgency effort. You had the hard counterinsurgency effort like that, but you also had surreptitious counterinsurgency effort like COINTELPRO, which was the FBI program to, in fact, stop the Black liberation movement, to assassinate Black leaders, to destroy Black organizations. And that program was very effective. And, you know, during the 60s, we saw many assassinations. Recently, you know, we observed some people observed the passing of the assassination of President Kennedy, but it was not only Kennedy. Medgar Evers was assassinated. Martin Luther King was assassinated. Malcolm X was assassinated, and on and on and on. Fred Hampton in Chicago was assassinated. These were assassinations. This was state power being used to kill the leaders of the Black movement, and the police were part of these efforts. Remember, Coretta Scott King, I'm trying to remember the year, I think it was 1999, went into federal court in Atlanta. And she only sued for $1 because she didn't want people to think that she was doing this for money. She sued to get the story out about how the government participated in the assassination of her husband. And it was shown in court that 11 intelligence agencies and the local police force in Memphis, Tennessee, all had a part in the plan to assassinate Dr. Martin Luther King. And more information, all information is still not out on that. And this is what the federal judge ruled. The judge ruled this, that there was a conspiracy to assassinate King, and that these intelligence agencies and the police participated. So we see that the police, as an instrument of state power, has been used over the centuries, the last 2 centuries, to in fact control, oppress, repress, and even destroy Black people and the Black movement. And it goes on unabated. Today in the United States, most people don't know that the police kill more than 1,000 people every year. Every year, like clockwork. I couldn't believe it when I first started looking at the statistics on this. It's almost like they had a quota. it's either 1,000 or 999 or 1,100, but it's always around that 1,000 mark every year in this country. The police in 1 year kill more people than the police in the United States in 1 year kill more people than the police in Great Britain killed in the entire 20th century. You know, Black people in this country, African Americans, we are close to 14%, 13 point something percent, close to 14% of the United States population. We are 38% of the 1,000 people killed every year. So almost 3 times our population size, 3 times that number are killed by the police. And we are 48%, we're 13% of the population, but we're 48% of the unarmed people killed in this country. The police don't just kill Black people. They kill Black people, they kill white people, they kill red, yellow, and brown people. But African Americans are nearly half of the unarmed people killed by the police every year. The other thing to note is that the FBI recently, in several reports over the past few years, have talked about how white supremacist organizations, the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI, said the greatest danger to American peace and security right now are violent white supremacist organizations. Just this past May, the New Jersey Department of Homeland Security said that the greatest threat to peace and safety in the state of New Jersey are violent white supremacist organizations. There are more than 250 white supremacist organizations dedicated to the violent overthrow of the United States government. And this doesn't include all the so-called militias that are around the country. And we see how dangerous these groups are. A report just came out just last week that racial bias crimes are at an all-time high. And coincidentally, since the election of Donald Trump. And we have seen these groups engage in murder all over the country, from the murder of Heather Heyer down there in South, I believe it was in South Carolina. These white supremacists have gone into synagogues and killed Jewish brothers and sisters, gone into churches. Dylan Roof went into Mother Emanuel and killed in cold blood 9 people while they were praying. White supremacists have gone into synagogues in Pennsylvania and in California and killed people. They've gone into department stores in Texas, killed Latino brothers and sisters. They've gone into mosques and killed Muslim brothers and sisters at an all-time high. But here's the problem. Also, the FBI issued a report less than 2 years ago saying that these violent white supremacists have infiltrated law enforcement at all levels in the United States of America. So we have not only the problem of police repression, but the intersection of police repression with racist white supremacist violence in the United States of America. I would submit this, and this is just one person's humble opinion, that what we have here is not just a police problem, but we have a problem of a rising fascist movement in this country. Now, to some, that might sound like hyperbole, but I think the facts and current events will back that up. And we see this rising fascist movement in this country. And one of the things we know about fascism in other countries is that one of the legs on which fascism stands is local police, is policing. Now, that's not to say that every police person is a fascist. I'm not saying that, but it is a fact that fascists use state power to repress their opposition, to repress the people. And we see this here in the United States. Remember when Biden and Trump had their first debate? What did Trump say to Biden? He said, Biden, all the police support me. None of the police support you. And in that rare instance, Donald Trump was telling the truth. A person who, according to the Washington Post, has told more than 20,000 lies, during the course of his presidency. I don't even know how you tell 20,000 lies. He must be the father of lies. But the fact remains, in 2016, in Donald Trump's first campaign, he was endorsed by the Ku Klux Klan, and he was endorsed by the 355,000 member Fraternal Order of Police. In his second campaign, he was endorsed by the 355,000 member Fraternal Order of Police. He was endorsed by the New Jersey Police Benevolent Association, and he was endorsed by the National Association of Police Organizations, which is like the police supervisory organizations. I mean, I don't think it's any small thing that the police had decided to align themselves with probably the most racist and maybe the most reactionary president we've had in our lifetime, maybe even in the contemporary period. I won't say the entire United States history, because seven of the first ones were slaveholders. So, but certainly in the contemporary era, he's certainly one of the most reactionary and racist presidents, and the police aligned themselves with him. As a reward to the police, after they endorsed his first campaign, what did he do? He appointed the unrepentant racist Jefferson Beauregard Sessions, who had been a senator in Georgia. He made him the head of the Justice Department. And what was his first order of business? You probably remember this. The first day after he was appointed, he said the Justice Department is not going to interfere with local policing. That was a signal to the police that they can do what they want. Furthermore, he said they were not going to implement any more consent decrees. Those are agreements that municipalities enter into to reform their police. They were not going to enter into any more consent decrees, and they were going to bring current consent decrees under review. So much for whatever the federal government was going to do about the police. How am I doing in terms of time? I don't want to go.
You should wind up now, Larry.
I should wind up? Okay, I'll wind it up. So the question is, what should we do about this police problem? First of all, the good news is that we had a massive outpouring of people this summer. Probably more demonstrations, more people participated in demonstrations against police brutality than ever before in the history of the United States this summer. In response, it was unfortunate that it was in the response to the murder of George Floyd, and probably so many people participated because they saw George Floyd's murder in real time. But people came out in massive numbers. People need to stay in the streets. The police who killed George Floyd, they haven't gone to trial yet. The police that killed Breonna Taylor, they haven't gone to trial yet. The retired policeman that killed Ahmaud Arbery, he hasn't gone to trial yet. What has changed? Nothing really has changed since then. So these police, we need to keep the demonstrations in the streets. People need to return to the streets. The great danger, I'm glad Trump was defeated. I supported the defeat of Trump. I called for the defeat of Trump. People's Organization for Progress marched every year against Trump. We marched against him before he was elected. We marched against him this year. But my fear is that because Trump is gone, people think that, they should return to business as usual. That would be the worst possible thing we could do. We must return to the streets after Biden takes office in January. We must have community control of the police. The primary problem is a question of power. The police have become a power unto themselves. This is why they can't be prosecuted. 99% of police brutality cases do not end in the prosecution of the police. It's a rare thing. It has happened, just as we have a blue moon. Every now and then it does happen that you get a conviction, but usually the conviction is not commensurate with the crime that was committed. We need community control. Every community should have some type of police review board or civilian oversight. And I'm going to end just with this in a minute. There are nearly 800,000 sworn police officers in the United States. The only country that has more police officers than the United States of America is the People's Republic of China. But the People's Republic of China has 4 times the size of the population of the United States. We actually have more police people per capita of the population. This is a great danger, brothers and sisters. It's not just Black communities that need police review board and community controls of the police. Every community needs police review boards or some type of civilian oversight mechanism and community control of police. We need a national standard on the use of excessive force. We need to end qualified immunity for the police. Now, in New Jersey, we just got body cams. The governor signed a law saying all the municipalities have to have body cams, but they didn't appropriate any money. And many municipalities don't have the money. So we got to get, if you say we got to have body cams, then the state needs to put up the money so that people will have body cams. And in recognition of George Floyd, every municipality should ban and outlaw chokeholds and any type of stranglehold restraints. And in honor of Breonna Taylor, every community should pass resolutions against no-knock warrants. Now, there are many other things, but I don't want to be a bad guest. So I'm going to end right now and sit back and listen to our next guest.
Thank you so much, Larry. Larry just proved, as you heard, that there's no conflict between being crystal clear and passionate.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Sandra Tamari. Sandra is a Palestinian American organizer. She's executive director of Adalah Justice Project. Earlier, Sandra worked for 10 years in higher education as an immigration specialist. And before that, as a senior program manager for Mid-East. She was also assistant director of Georgetown University's Center for Contemporary Arab Studies and a grant writer researcher for Al-Jannah, the Arab Resource Center for Popular Arts in Beirut. Sandra is a co-founder of the St. Louis Palestine Solidarity Committee. She was co-chair of the steering committee for the U.S. campaign for Palestinian rights from 2015 to 2018. Mike Brown's murder in August 2014 greatly affected Sandra's work. Since then, she is focused on building joint liberation efforts between Palestinians and Black communities. And she was a lead organizer of the Palestinian contingent to Ferguson in October 2014. Sandra, you're up.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone. Larry, thank you for that amazing history lesson and call to action. I'm inspired, and I hope I can follow on and give us some more to think about how these systems that Larry so beautifully described really spread beyond our own borders, and how U.S. imperialism, U.S. foreign policy, comes back. is part of the plan. Just to build on the introduction, thank you, Steve. I am based here in St. Louis. I'm a Palestinian who was born in the U.S. When I was a young person, many moons ago, I went to Palestine for the first time during the first Intifada, the first Palestinian. Well, it's named the first Intifada, but it wasn't the first rebellion among Palestinians, but known as the first Intifada, which happened from 1987 to about 1993. I was there right in the middle of that uprising. And that uprising was really inspiring and beautiful and really provided me with my political education, seeing the political unity, the organizing, the mutual aid that has become so popularized and resurgent. During this pandemic, seeing the women leaders, and from that moment on, my whole life has been to support the work of that resistance and resistance like it. So when the Ferguson Rebellion happened here in just down the street from where I live back in 2014, as many of you will recall, that was the same summer that Gaza was being assaulted yet again by Israel, where over 2,000 Palestinians in Gaza were killed by aerial bombs and military incursions into Gaza from every side, from the air, from the land, from the sea. And my emotional state was already in a difficult place. My heart was broken watching that unfold and not seeing the world community really pay any attention to it. When that Saturday morning, August 9th, 2014, the day that Michael Brown was assassinated, an extrajudicial killing by police as he was walking down the street. There was reports on Twitter that a young man was bleeding out in the street, and people had gathered, and the police were preventing anyone from getting near him. In August in St. Louis, and I can imagine everywhere now, in New Jersey too, is a very brutally hot month in St. Louis. So to imagine, we were hearing reports that this person's mother was trying to get to him and was unable to get there. They left the body to bleed out for 4.5 hours. We didn't know his name, but already before we knew the details of what had happened, the dehumanization campaign began. Already we were hearing, he pulled a gun on the officer. He was, running from the police. He was a fugitive because he had killed someone. He had, robbed a store. The speculation, was happening. Finally, we knew his name and we knew the truth. Unarmed man who had put his hands up, right? Trying to avoid the killer cop. And that was, I think, the moment that my whole orientation to organizing changed fundamentally. And I knew that the work that I was doing to end the violence, state violence in Israel against my people had to extend broader. And I had to think about systems in a different way. What Israel does is not unique and not exceptional. And what Palestinians experience is not exceptional. And so we don't have to go very far in our own neighborhoods here in the U.S. to find Gaza. So I think that's one of the lessons that I've learned from this new reawakening, this resurgence of Black Palestinian solidarity. One of the pillars of the U.S. and Israel, who are both settler colonial states that rely on division and racial discrimination, is this racial profiling. When I tried to return to Palestine in 2012, I was stopped at the airport and asked questions like, what is your father's name? What is your grandfather's name? And when I answered those questions with those Arab names, I was pulled aside into what is known to Palestinians as the Palestinian room or the brown room, where other people of color are pulled in. and spent 8 hours being interrogated 5 different times. I was able to call the U.S. Embassy and tell them I was being held. And when I got the call back, the first question that the officer asked me is, "Are you Jewish?" And when I answered no, they said, "Well, there's nothing we can do to help you." Now, I'll remind you, I'm a U.S. citizen. I'll remind you I was born in the U.S. and this is the kind of racial profiling, right, that the U.S. Has adopted. The same logic of discrimination that Israel implements among Palestinians. And so I think it's important for us to dig into that a little bit and to understand why that happens. So I want to talk about Palestine as an abolitionist struggle. We've heard this word. It's become popularized, as Larry said, about different words, which is exciting, right? That's the beauty of the political education moment that rebellions provide. But there's an abolitionist struggle that's happening now, abolition of the prison industrial complex. And what I would say is that Palestinians have always viewed their struggle as an abolitionist struggle. There's no confusion among Palestinians that there's any reform of Zionism. There's no illusion among Palestinians that there can be a reform of a state system that calls for your complete erasure, calls for your complete annihilation. Palestinians don't necessarily use the term annihilation, but we understand it. We understand that every part of the system, every part of Zionism has to be dismantled for there to be true justice for Palestinians. Dismantling Zionism, of course, all of you who are members of JVP know that that doesn't mean an erasure of the Jewish people from the land of Palestine. What it does mean, though, that there has to be a decolonization of the land. And that requires the way that abolitionists talk about this notion here in the U.S., it requires a change in thinking and a change in our relationships with one another. And that we absolutely have a pathway to practice, that we have to practice daily of dealing with each other in new ways. So when people say defund the police, they're not just talking about chaos and anarchy and crime, and they're talking about a new way of being in the world. And so, what is the visionary, what is the new vision of the future that we can bring in a call to end Zionism? As you know, Zionism is a political ideology that created the Jewish supremacist state of Israel in Palestine and led to the beginnings of the Nakba, the destruction of over 500 Palestinian villages, the forced displacement of 750,000 Palestinians from their homes. And it's driven by the logic of elimination. To have a new population come in and take over the land means that indigenous population has to be erased, has to be eliminated. And that process continues to this day. Edward Said wrote about Zionism in a really beautiful essay, Zionism from the Standpoint of Its Victims, in 1979. What does the Palestinian think as he watches Zionism described today? Zionism appeared to be an uncompromising, exclusionary, discriminatory colonialist praxis. It has been impossible for Palestinians to see Zionism as anything except an ideology and a practice of keeping them imprisoned. So what Palestine teaches us is that carceral systems are not limited to prisons and policing. They are central, but they are only part of a greater picture. We have other systems such as surveillance, racial profiling, and of course, the fencing off of territories, which has been perfected in Gaza. Most extreme and a violent expression of Zionism today, where you have 1.8 million Palestinians living in 360 square kilometers, a ghetto, really, a large prison. And the reason that Palestinians today are imprisoned is because their return to their ancestral villages threatens Israel demographically. Too many of the wrong kinds of people. This absolutely should be a moral crisis for the world, but security arguments, such as terrorism, are put forth by Israel and are accepted by the world. Just this past summer, 5 days after the murder of George Floyd, on May 30th, 2020, Israeli police killed a Palestinian autistic man, 32 years old, Iyad al-Halak. He was in Jerusalem on his way to his school. He was asked to stop at a checkpoint. A checkpoint is another system of control, many of them throughout the West Bank and in Jerusalem. Jerusalem being one of the most surveilled cities in the entire world, cameras everywhere, checkpoints everywhere. He was ordered to stop by officers, and he didn't understand. He was confused. He tried to pull his cell phone out of his pocket. The police say they thought it was a gun. They chased him. 7 shots were fired at him, and he died on the streets there. His family, of course, is looking for justice. There's very little justice in a system that's designed to erase you. And one of the most curious things about his case, I mean, because unfortunately, this kind of tragedy is a daily occurrence in Palestine. There are cameras, as I said, everywhere in the city. Back in 1999, Israeli police contracted with a technology company to establish a program called Mabat 2000, which set up hundreds of cameras in the old city, which we know is a flashpoint and a really difficult place of contention and violence. And what the lawyers of the family of Iyad Halak tried to do was get the surveillance camera footage from the murder to be able to show what had happened. And the government, the state, claimed that the cameras weren't working. They tested this theory, the family, the lawyers. They went and they covered the cameras with jackets. They just threw them up there on them and they covered them. And within minutes, the clothing was taken down. And they said, well, how do you claim, right, that these cameras aren't working when you knew immediately that they had been blocked, right? So obviously, the surveillance works only in one direction. So they know exactly what happened. They refuse to take responsibility for it. But to show you that, also to say that these types of surveillance systems that Israel is exporting has the most surveillance, companies in the world per capita. They're being imported back to the U.S. Here in St. Louis, there's a proposal for a fusion center. These are, police centers where they can coordinate with the FBI, with ICE, with different agencies, and they have video cameras throughout the city that they can come together and under the idea of crime prevention or surveillance, they're using it as another tool of control and domination over, unwanted populations. So, going back to my original thesis of, we have to understand that these problems don't have borders, and our racial justice struggles should have no borders. Also, it's important for us to recognize that there's a really purposeful agenda at play here, where the state, the U.S. and in Israel, want to draw a hard line between what's happening here and what's happening there. And in the U.S., they want to draw a hard line between policing and military operations outside the border of the U.S. It's an effective strategy to divide us and to keep us confused and to prevent us from joining together in liberation work, collective liberation work. But however, it's important for us to remember that from the moment that in this country, the U.S. government completed its territorial conquest to the Pacific coast, it began looking for overseas ventures, for new land and people to control and to capitalize from. So our foreign policy is simply an extension of domestic policy. Remember that more than half of federal discretionary spending is designated for the military, for defense. So more than half of the money that we pay into our tax coffers is designated for the military. But when you look at municipal budgets, it's the same percentage. In most cities, it's between 30 to 50% of municipal budgets go directly to policing. So these are the priorities at both the municipal and the federal level. And maintaining law and order at home and abroad is a critical priority for capitalists, for the elites of this country. The threat of liberation is a threat to all in their minds. And the repression of one is lessons for the repression of all. I'll say that again. The threat of liberation to one is a threat to all. And the repression of one is lessons for the repression of all. So they're learning from each other. They're studying these systems. And as Larry, correctly analyzed, militarization of the police started happening in the 60s. What happened is that we were at war in Vietnam, and we were using really, really horrible technologies to put down people's movements there. And the police were like, we don't have that kind of equipment. We need it. We're fighting battles. The Watts riots in LA were the place where they tested a lot of this technology, and they brought it back. And from the 60s onward, we've seen an increased militarization of policing in the U.S. We have the 1033 program, which is a program that allows excess military equipment to come back to police departments, started in 1997. That's why when the Ferguson Rebellion happened, we saw every technology that's used in the military arenas in Iraq, Afghanistan, the Hummer vehicles, the tanks, the kinds of the tear gas, the noise machines, the skunk gas, this kind of thing all came back. And all of this is done under, the promise of security. So it changes. It depends on the season. It was the war on drugs at one point. It was the war against communism prior to that. But now it's the war on terror, used to justify, militarized responses to all kinds of issues. We saw, just this summer also the launch of Operation Legend, used to crack down on, anarchists, right? Anarchist forces and protect federal buildings. So, there's always going to be the boogeyman. There's always going to be a reason for this militarization. The frameworks create fictionalized enemies so that they can sell the lie to us that we need this technology. And one of the ways too that they avoid transparency and control is that they seek private funding of the training and equipment. For example, here a private funder has offered to pay for a trial run of drone surveillance of the city for 2 years. This is a way to bypass, a vote within the city council. The budget will, the city budget doesn't have to be used for it. So a private billionaire can come in and fund it, and then 2 years down the road, the city can say, "Well, we need it. We absolutely need it. Look at what it's done." And this is the same way that the ADL and other, organizations have been providing private funding for training of the U.S. police with little to no accountability. So we have work ahead of us. I'll echo the analysis that we have a lot of work ahead of us. Yes, the defeat of Trump was an important victory, but Biden told his donors, his billionaire donors, that, quote, nothing will fundamentally change, and he meant it. Right before the election, when Biden was predicted to win, the president of Raytheon Technologies said there was no reason to be alarmed with Joe Biden as president because military spending would continue as the same rate. He said, "I think it's ridiculous to think that he's going to cut spending on the military." That's a bipartisan issue. So we can't be complacent. What I would, remind us is that abolition organizing is Palestine work. If we are fighting the front against police brutality, we're fighting the front of Palestinian liberation. And when Black and Indigenous people in the U.S. win, I absolutely believe that Palestinians win. We all win. So thank you. Look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Sandra, so much. And we do we do have some time for questions, like a half hour. There is on the bottom of your computer a place where it says participants. And if you click that on, you will see a place for you to raise your hand, to click the hand button at the bottom of the participant thing, if you bring it up. I hope I'm explaining this right. David, can you explain it more clearly?
You did well. You have 3 people with their hands up already.
David Surrey of another member of Jewish Voice for Peace, like I am, is going to see who raises their hands first, and you'll be the ones who will get to ask questions. Please keep your questions brief so we can get to a few people and we can hear what Larry and Sandra say in response to your questions.
Okay, so could you raise your hands one more time? It seemed to have bounced out. You were there a second ago. That's bizarre. Okay, I saw your faces there a second ago. Okay, we're gonna, I guess, switch to chat because I saw the hands up. So let me just do that. We'll do it in chat and I'll just monitor it as it comes and call on them. So chat is now open. Anybody have questions, please, or comments?
You know how to use the chat?
Yeah, yes. Should we type
your
out in chat?
comment or question?
Okay, so excuse me on the pronunciation, but Yoshio, yes, type out your question. Okay, the first question is ADL is funding. Please say more.
Yeah,
Sandra, it sounds like that's for you.
sure. Yeah, the Anti-Defamation League is very proud, actually, of its training of U.S. police, both in Israel and with Israeli police that come to the U.S. or Israeli, defense forces. There's a very active campaign to expose that and to try to push ADL out of progressive coalitions. They tout themselves as being, an anti-hate group. But what they do is that they hide behind this facade of fighting discrimination to support all policies that Israel supports. There's a lot more information at stoptheadl.org. I'll just say at the height of the Ferguson protest, the ADL awarded the St. Louis police with a humanitarian award. That just gives you a sense of where their loyalties are at.
Okay. Sally G, what is asking you both, what do we do about police unions?
Well, we have to do something about the unions because they are the main advocates for this super status that the police have. The police have a super status. That is, if they go out and commit a murder, if they kill an unarmed civilian, they do not have to worry about prosecution to the same degree that an average citizen, because they have federal laws, state laws. Like recently, legislation was passed to to further strengthen the super status of police by making an attack on the police a hate crime. This is just one more brick in the wall that, surrounds the police and protects them from prosecution. So this is a struggle that will have to be carried out primarily, not primarily, not exclusively, but certainly at the local level. Most recently, for instance, in Newark, New Jersey, for half a century, the people of Newark wanted a police review board. Then finally, Ras Baraka was elected in 2014. And within a year, through an executive order, he created a police review board. And the following year, the municipal council codified it in law. Once the city council did that, the police union, Fraternal Order of Police Lodge number 12 in Newark, went into court to stop the police review board on the premise that the city did not have the power to bestow subpoena power on the police review board. They won at the Superior Court level. The city won at the appellate court level, but the police fought up to the state Supreme Court. And in August, the state Supreme Court ruled that Newark could have a police review board, but it couldn't have subpoena power. So you see, the police are not just a paramilitary force. They are a political force. They support candidates for office. They oppose candidates for office. They lobby for laws to work in their favor. And to fight this, we have to confront them. On the 22nd of October, the People's Organization for Progress, we led a protest at the Fraternal Order of Police headquarters, Lodge number 12 on McCarter Highway in Newark. And we're going to continue to demonstrate against them until we finally get this situation overturned. The struggle for subpoena power for the review board in Newark is now going on in the state legislature. Assemblywoman Angela McKnight from Jersey City is putting forward legislation to, in fact, enable municipalities to create review boards that will have subpoena power. So it's a multi-dimensional struggle. The struggle against the police unions will have to be carried out at the local level. The city councils and the community are going to have to struggle to take some of those provisions that are in police contracts. It's not just the law, it's their contracts that give them this extra protection. For instance, there's the 48-hour rule. A police officer doesn't even have to give an account for what happened for 48 hours. There are many things in their contract that they have abrogated to themselves that should, in fact, be the authority of the municipality and not the authority of the police. So we have to carry out some very precise and targeted struggles against the union to, in fact, get that power back to municipalities and then get civilian oversight of the police.
Thank you. Rod Bloom for Sandra. Do you work with any Israeli groups?
So the Adalah Justice Project is a Palestinian organization based here in the U.S., but our origin story goes back to Israel. We're the outgrowth of the U.S. work of Adalah, the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel. Based in Israel, representing Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, represent 20% of the citizenry of the state. Obviously we have relationships inside Israel, and we work with those groups. We work with groups who are committed to resisting, the state's discrimination. There are very few of those Israeli groups, unfortunately. But yes, of course, we do work with the ones who are committed to a restructuring, a decolonization process in the land.
Thank you. Terry Corso asked, are there, for either of you, I guess, are there other police organizations in the U.S. that who we can work with about this situation? I think that's.
I'm not muted, am I? You can hear me, right?
No, you're not muted, but something's wrong with your mic, but we could hear you sort of.
Oh boy. All right. I'll let the other panelists go. I'm gonna come out and come back in so I can get clarity. All right.
Okay, so Sandra, do you want to start?
I'm sorry. I was the question what other organizations
Are there other police organizations that you can work with?
The question's a little parallel to the questions about working with any Israeli groups. Are there any police organizations that it's possible to work with?
Yeah, I mean, I do not know of any, and that wouldn't be my tactic, my tact in approaching the work. That seems to me to be like the ADL approach, right? They want to put like a rainbow flag on police cars, or they want to like teach them about, anti-Semitism and then call it a day. Like they put a nice face on the police, and I don't believe that that's useful. I don't think that there's reform. As I said, I'm an abolitionist, and I believe that, police need to be defunded, and we don't need to be putting more energy, more funding, or strengthening their power in any way. So my goal is to end policing in this country, certainly the way it's done today.
Okay, I don't think Larry's back yet.
I'm back.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Oh, good. Now we can hear you, Larry.
Yeah. Technical difficulties. Over the years, there have been a few progressive police organizations, and I think you have to search them out in each community. We used to have one in this area called Black Cops Against Police Brutality, which was led by then Sergeant DeLacy Davis. He's now Dr. DeLacy Davis. He's a retired police officer now, but I don't know if his group is still active. There are some police officers, individuals who are very progressive. That former police chief in Seattle, Stamper, has put out, I think, 2 books on reforming the police. But I think for the most part, people have to build strong organizations. Reforming the police is going to be one of the toughest things. I mean, I'm for defunding the police. I'm for abolition of the police. But, those are long-term projects. And in the meantime, for the foreseeable future, we're going to have police. And if we can reform them, we should. I just want to give a little example, right? I had mentioned that in Newark, we fought for a police review board. Mayor Baraka established it. The city council made it permanent. The police went to court and got the court to take away the subpoena power. Now we're fighting in the legislature. But one of the reasons that Mayor Baraka went forward with implementing the police review board was because Newark was brought under a consent decree. The police in Newark were so bad that the ACLU reached out to the Justice Department. Justice Department came in and did an investigation, and they put Newark under a consent decree and under a federal monitor. I'm speaking anecdotally now. I don't have hard statistics in front of me, but just from an anecdotal point of view, with the election of the new mayor and the consent decree and the federal monitor, it appears that the number of police brutality cases has declined. I'm not saying there isn't any police brutality or there aren't any problems with the police. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that it's not at the level it was, say, 8 or 9 years ago. So just the mere fact that the Justice Department came in, did have some effect. So, things can be done to ameliorate the situation, but the best antidote to police brutality is the organized and mobilized people. I don't care how much legislation you pass, how many regulations you change. If you don't have public pressure for an end to police brutality, murder of unarmed civilians, violation of constitutional rights, the law will just be ignored.
Okay. Now the hand raised function is working, so I'm going to call on people in order that they raise their hands. Starting with Janine, unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate this talk, and I learned so much that I'm a college student and we don't get taught this stuff, right? So I'm really happy that I got to sit for this talk. My question was, are there any similarities in tactics between when policing Palestinians and policing particularly Black Americans here in the United States? For example, like the image of the police officer with his knee on George Floyd's neck is an image we see a lot from the Palestinian side.
That's for either of you.
Ladies first.
Questions especially for Sandra.
Thank you, Larry. Sure. Hi, Janine. I'm glad you're here. Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of, like I said, repression is learned, and they do compare notes, and the training happens. It's not just Israel and the U.S., but authoritarian regimes around the globe are trading tactics. Israel is claims that it has, the best technology that's been tested and tried and tested on Palestinians in crowd control. So, here in Ferguson, we saw that kind of, this, obviously tear gas is an important tool in this. Kettling, which you've seen maybe in some news stories where they force people into circles and they trap them to do mass arrests. That happened here in St. Louis. That happens in Palestine too during demonstrations. And then one of the things that we have exported to Israel is stop and frisk, which those of you in the New York area certainly know about. Stop and frisk was a program that Israel adopted, and you see lots of pictures of that kind of frisking of young Palestinian men, usually in the city, especially in Jerusalem. So there's lots of back and forth, but it's whatever tactics will repress and keep rebellions down.
I agree with everything Sandra said.
That might be a wise decision. Carol Strauss, I gotta unmute you. Carol Strauss, you gotta unmute yourself now. You're still muted. Okay, go ahead.
I didn't know that I had my hand up.
Okay.
From long ago I did. So no, I'm listening. I don't have a specific question. If there's somebody else in the line here.
Sally G. Sally?
Yeah, I've lost track. I guess the concern is I watched the Ferguson happen online. I watched North Dakota and Standing Rock and thinking, how can this be happening in my country? And yet it is, and it has been, and all of us are more aware of it now. And the fusion centers, you mentioned another one popping up there. How do we break this? How do we? Not in my name, damn it. Yeah.
I think the way to break it was foreshadowed by this summer. This summer was a magnificent wave of protests. I'm 66 years old. I'll be 67 in a couple of weeks. On the 24th of December, I'll be 67. I never saw anything like I saw this summer. You couldn't have paid me to believe that some of the towns that had Black Lives Matter demonstrations would have had them. I mean, these towns that you never saw protests in. Usually if I tell you there's going to be a protest in Newark, you say, yeah, usually. Patterson, yeah, usually, and so forth. But all these little towns in Essex County, in Montclair, they had 3 demonstrations that had more than 1,000 people each. And I'm telling you, the police backed up. They did. Now, they didn't, it didn't, the backup wasn't in terms of legislation or policy, but they backed up in terms of their political power. They were backed up. They were on the defensive. They were on their heels. And in fact, in a lot of these towns, you know, the elected officials had to join the protest because they knew if they didn't join the protest, you know, they would be looked at suspiciously, you know, and some of them got in front. Even in some towns, some of the police got in the protest. So they had to back up. So the way forward is to continue in various forms, not just in the streets, but in various forms, this kind of mass rejection of police murder of unarmed civilians, use of excessive force, violation of constitutional rights, false arrests, discriminatory police tactics like stop and frisk, that this is totally unacceptable. Is unacceptable regardless who is the president. And you know, people want things to go back to normal. The worst thing we can do is to go back to normal, because normal is what got us into this situation with Trump.
Sandra?
Yeah, I'm going to agree with Larry on this one. It's going to take a lot of us, and it has to be in the streets. It has to be electorally. It has to be all the weapons that are available to us, all the strategies that we can muster. We have to be more creative. And, you know, I do have a lot of hope. This summer was very inspiring in the pandemic to see that kind of force. I don't think we can go back to normal. I don't think it's possible. I mean, some people will find it fine. You know, we have these jokes about, you know, the women are going to go back to brunch, you know, once Kamala's in office. It's, you know, but the majority, you know, the drop in the rapid rise in poverty that we're seeing now, the unemployment rates, you know, the way that the lack of healthcare in this country is being exposed in new ways, the way that the budgets are, you know, the budget priorities are going to be exposed in new ways. We don't have money for people to eat. We don't have money for people to stay in their homes. We have money for policing. We have money for defense. I think that all of this is, you know, these are the questions that we need to be raising all the time and pushing forward. And I think that, you know, if we can't do it now, we'll never be able to do it.
I agree. And I just want to say a couple of things real quick that, as I said at the beginning, the People's Organization for Progress, we support the struggle of the Palestinian people for justice, for self-determination, for human rights, their struggle against Israeli apartheid, their historic struggle. You know, we must do more to make people aware. I mean, it's in the news, but that organic relationship needs to be strengthened. I was in high school the first time I heard about the Palestinian struggle. I didn't know. The only time I knew about Palestine is when I went to Sunday school, and the word Palestine was like in the Bible, right? And in high school, one of my fellow classmates, believe his name was Henry Darden. He was a young member of the Black Panther Party. And in like 1969, 1970, he would come to school with, is it called a keffiyeh, that scarf? Yes, he would come to school with that on. And I say, like, Henry, why are you wearing that scarf? And he would explain to me. And where did he learn that from? He learned it from the Black Panther Party. I was a delegate to the National Black Political Convention in Gary, Indiana in 1972. People who know about contemporary African-American history know that that was one of the significant political events of, you know, the contemporary era. I remember the thing that caused a rift in the National Black Political Assembly. the National Black Political Assembly ratified a document called the National Black Political Agenda. And we had to vote on that agenda in the plenary session at the convention. There was one little plank in the National Black Political Agenda that said, we support self-determination for the Palestinian people. This was in March of 1972. It was the Michigan delegation who said that if we ratified that agenda, that plank, they would walk out. And we ratified it, and they did walk out. Amiri Baraka was one of the co-conveners of the National Black Political Convention, and in the early 70s, he was a supporter of the struggle of the Palestinian people for self-determination. And lastly, in 2014, I think it was 14 when Ferguson happened, I was in Penn Station. I was going to buy something at one of those newspaper stands. And I looked down and saw the New York Times. There was a picture on the front page of the New York Times. I swear, I thought it was a picture from Palestine of Israeli soldiers attacking youth in Palestine. It was Ferguson. It was Ferguson, where the police were all dressed up like soldiers. They had a tank. Where they get the tank from? From the 1033 program that Sandra mentioned earlier. So these are just some personal kinds of things that I have gone through. You know, I remember when Arafat was holed up. Was it in the embassy or the headquarters, PLO headquarters, when he was under actual like military attack? You know, we sent a number of telegrams to all of our federal officials saying, stop the attack on Arafat. And to this day, I want to say the People's Organization for Progress, we support BDS. We support BDS, boycott, divest, sanctions for justice for the Palestinians. And recently I was on I don't know, Sandra, if you know Norman Finkelstein. I was on a panel with Norman Finkelstein at Princeton University on the historical relationship between African Americans and the Palestinian struggle. So those are just some things I wanted to mention.
I'm going to turn it over to Steve Gollan now.
Well, I think that was a great windup by Larry. Sandra, do you have any last thing you want to contribute as we reach our ending today?
You know, I think we've touched on so much. I just want to say thank you again. I appreciate everyone's commitment, right, to our collective liberation. It's all of us, right, or none of us. That's the lesson we know. And I look forward to seeing you all in the streets when it's safe. Let's do it.
I think one of the special things tonight, which our speakers embodied, was hearing from the Palestinian struggle and the Black struggle side by side and seeing the interconnections. We're all vaguely aware of that, but spending a whole evening looking at that, the parallels and the connections, and the connections between the police brutality in both cases. I think that made this a very special event. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. A pleasure to be with you all.